Hi guys. I wanted to go through the options that are available in Rebirth, which are really in two areas. One is in this optional mods folder, and the other is in this configurations folder. So let's go with the optional mods folder first, and we'll go through the different modlets that you can use. By default, I'll use the Wandering Horde as an example. There's a Wandering Horde times 3, which is right here. It's part of the main folder. So anything that's in this mods folder directly will be picked up. So if you were to maybe take away the times 3, put it back in this folder, and take the times 6, then you'll get, wandering hordes that are much, much larger. So in terms of what each one of these does, about the wandering hordes. The larger blood hordes is essentially going to give you more zombies during each blood moon. Um, you'll get a much larger number of entities that are alive at any one given time, and the total number of number of entities is going to be much larger as well. So by default, I think it scales up. It's still a lot larger than vanilla. Vanilla only lasts until you kill X number of zombies. By default, Rebirth will have Horde Nights that last all nights. But if you were to pick this one, then it'll be just drastically increased. Then you've got these two belt mods. This one is for a 16:9 monitor, and this one is if you have an ultra widescreen monitor. Both will offer 20 slots in your tool belt. The more working vehicle ones is if you are using, and by default it is in there, the Vehicle Madness mods, which is this one here. Including this one will give you a bit more working vehicles in world, but you have to use that when you're creating a new world. Adding it after the fact won't necessarily increase that amount, because these vehicles, these placeholders, are done at world creation. The UI tweaks, that's for the old UI. I don't really use that anymore because it's based on SMX right now. But if you were to take the SMX ones out and put that one in, then you go back to a much older UI. So we've talked about the Wandering Hordes one. The X marks the spot is about you, I wouldn't say needing to do headshots, but if you were to shoot the zombies elsewhere but the heads, they take very minimal damage. Won't go to survival yet. Better performance is for people that typically play multiplayer. It's not a single player modlet. In multiplayer, some of the NPCs, whether it's your traders or the survivors you hire, their AI does affect the frame rates. And so if you're feeling that there's a lot of lag, if you have a certain amount of players, because each player gets their own traders and gets their own hired survivors, so whenever they face a horde, for example, a large number of entities, then this will actually cause some loss in frame rate and sometimes lag that's just unbearable. So using this will render these traders inactive in terms of them fighting, but at the same time they will be invincible and the zombies won't target them, so you can't use them as a way to get zombies to attack a target and you attack the zombies in return. And it also removes the ability to hire survivors. So essentially what it does is that you can't have NPCs outside of the ones that spawn in biomes target the zombies. And then the loot times one is if you want an instant loot, you won't have the timer. It just opens the containers right away. Now, the survival one is if you want to have a different experience with the game, you don't start the game as quickly as you do with the default setup, which is essentially you kill a bunch of zombies and then you'll get access to Briston and your class and all that. It takes a bit more time. I think you have to hit player level 5 before Briston actually shows up. And there's a bunch of stuff that's just harder in this mod. You have to, slowly ramp up, and if you want a challenge, then I would suggest you use this. So this covers what's inside the optional mods folder. Now, the other aspect I talked about was inside configurations. So configurations, if you were to go and check out some of these, we'll start with the blocks one. So by default, I set a certain amount of time for crops to grow. If you want them to grow faster, then you reduce this amount. If you want the crops to take a bit more time, then you would increase that amount. And I've set some labels so you can actually see what this means. If you want to disable the trader production, you reduce that just a little bit. You see by default, the trader is protected, but if you were to set this to true, then you would disable the trader protection. The lock picking, I wouldn't touch that. The one block crouching is set to false, but if you want to be able to, as a player, crouch beneath one block, then you would do that. I wouldn't touch the faction tags. And these two, the zombie stuff, I mean, you can decide to have zombies maybe try and avoid traps and set that to true, or have random walks. The issue with the random walks I saw is that sometimes the zombies will crouch and or crawl and then all of a sudden get up, and it's just it's a little weird. So I would keep that to false. So in this file, I would stick to the growth rates. You can uncheck that if you want to get seeds at the same time as you harvest, but right now I don't see why you would do that, because they auto reseeds, and the trader production as well as the crouching. So that takes care of the blocks. And then if we were to let's go to buffs at the ends. Entity classes, this will give you the amount of time you'll be able to loot from zombie corpses. So they will by default despawn after 120 seconds, which is 2 minutes. That's the only one in there. In terms of the traders, that's the reset interval is for how often do they restock. So right now they restock every single day, and setting it to the same time here keeps them open all the time. So if you were to set that to different times, then you could actually define a opening and close time. And then the last one you want to look at is this buffs one. And this one is the biggest one. So the first option is the ability to supply your traders with ammunition if you want them to shoot. If you don't, so if you set this to 1, then you would need to supply them with ammunition if you want them to shoot, and they would use up that ammo until they have no more. And the way you access that is through their dialogue. Once this set is set to true, you could access their tool belts. You can essentially drop some ammo in there. This other setting is if you want your hired survivors to leave during blood moons, then you would set that to 1. And the other one, sorry, this is, hide during blood moon. So if you were to play multiplayer and you want the frame rates to be better, those options you can play with, because the less ammo your traders have, obviously the less they can shoot, and it'll impact the frame rates. And if your survivors leave when there's a blood moon, then it's the same thing. The frame rates will go down because they're just not there. In terms of the zombies, so this part they grow stronger. And they grow stronger after a certain number of levels. They'll start to be able to shock you or set you on fire, etc. And they'll have some particles that show you on their hands what they will do, whether it's shock or burn. And you can turn this on or off. So right now it's on. And they're set to a fairly high intensity, so you can see them easily. But you can turn this to 0 and it'll be harder to see those particles on their hands. If, for example, you're in a POI and you want to be able to not necessarily know what kind of zombie it is. So that's where you would change that. This here will restrict how many survivors you can hire. Right now it's gated by charisma and charismatic nature. If you were to set this to 0, then you can hire as many as you want. By default, it's up to 4 you can hire per person. When touch the chunk observers, the quick heal is the ability to use the quick heal ability. So by default, it's set to 1. Let's see what else. This is all things that you may want to turn off under misery, so they grow stronger. If you don't want them to grow stronger, you set this to 0, and that essentially removes the entire misery line. And if you don't want them to, and this is mostly for maybe Twitch users, if they are going to die often and they don't want the zombies to get more physical damage resistance as they die, then they'd want this to be turned off. Create a bandit event. If you find those are too tough, you can turn those off. Same with seekers and wraiths that come to your base. If you find them annoying or if you just don't want to have to deal with those, you can turn those off. Same thing with the cybernetics that will spawn during blood moons. If you find those too difficult, you can turn that off. The mercenaries manual activation, right now you can use a hotkey to activate them. And if you were to put that to 0, then the game will, the mod will determine when you're low life and you need them to pop out. Same thing with defensive rage. This gives you the ability to trigger it with a hotkey, and which is something you can do right now. And if you set it to 0, then you disable that ability. Everything underneath is tied to your progression, and so I wouldn't necessarily touch that too much. I was using that mostly for myself so that I don't have to go through the hundreds and thousands of XML that I've created for this. The ones you may want to change, I mean, right now it's been balanced as much as possible. It just makes sense based on these values. But if you want to increase how much XP you get from doing things when it comes to your genetics, so let's say every time you were to salvage, which gives you some intelligence experience, if you wanted that to maybe be increased, so let's say you want to double the XP, then you would put 4 instead of 2 here. So this is a multiplier. Same thing with the class and the expertise experience. Right now it's set to 0.3, but if you wanted to level faster, then you would increase these values. And everything else, I wouldn't touch necessarily. You can play with it if you want, but there's just a whole bunch of values based on the different classes. The values every time you do a certain action when it comes to, say, every time you fight or you break some ore, or salvage, etc. So those have been balanced over time as people have played the mod and given feedback. But if you do want to play with them, go ahead. This is where you do that. And with that, we're pretty much done with the configuration options. And as you see the date here, it's the 16th of August 2022. So these are the options as of this date. Following this video, more could be added, but at least you'll know where to look for them. You either look for them inside this optional mods folder or edit the values inside of configurations. And with that, have fun.